Hi guys, it's Kian. Today I wanted to talk about some things that are very obvious. And I think there's something interesting with obvious things in that sometimes things appear so obvious to us that we don't think about how, um, I guess, one, that they are even worth mentioning, and two, that they may not be obvious to other people who don't have the same kind of context, whether it's like social, cultural upbringing, or whatever other experiences that you've had. Um, and so I want to talk about some things that are particularly obvious to me. I don't know whether they are obvious to you. And I think the risk with saying things that are obvious is always that there would be people who will be like, duh, obviously it's this way, right? Like, obviously it's that way. But I think what's more interesting is that there are people who are equally puzzled that it's obvious. And the thing is that these people are not dumb. Um, they are just not exposed to the same kind of context that people who find certain things obvious have, and therefore they don't find these things obvious, if that makes sense. So I think, like, I'm just going to go into what I think are particularly obvious. Feel free to share anything that you think is very obvious in your own context below, because yeah, why not, let's just talk about in a way mundane things that are actually not that mundane once you think about it. So I think the first thing that made this list is um in Mandarin we call it 如意油, which is I think the brand of the medicated oil. It is, I'll put a picture somewhere, but it is basically I think if you're in Singapore or like Asian countries, it's quite obvious what this is for. It is a medicated oil that is kind of has some like menthol minty kind of properties that kind of heats up when you put it on, and usually people put it on their tummy when they feel unwell, usually when they have like a stomach ache. The advertisements that they have basically tells you to do that anyway. And it's such an obvious thing to me that growing up I've always had this in the house, when especially when I was a kid. I think I got a lot of tummy aches much more often, and it's just a very familiar smell. It's like tummy ache association will be go get the 如意油, put it on your belly, and then you'll feel better afterwards. The funny thing about it is that in the advertisement that it has, it always talks about how after you put it, you'll fart. I don't always, but like it's quite funny that that's the thing that sticks in my head about the advert. And so I never really thought about it as an obvious thing necessarily, because it's just kind of in the background as I grew up. But having traveled to countries where this is not really a thing, it became more apparent that this is actually an obvious thing that is not obvious to other people at all. So I think the first time I encountered it was like I was in Australia visiting a friend. They are also Asian. They spend quite a big portion of their years in Singapore. But for some reason, when I was visiting them and I had a stomach ache, my first thought was stomach ache, 如意油, which by the way is just the name of the medicated oil. And they had none. They didn't even have 风油, which is, and I'm saying all of this as if it's obvious. So if it is, you're gonna find these explanations very boring, and if it's not, you're gonna hopefully find these explanations helpful. So 风油 is a different type / brand of medicated oil, and the reason why I'm having a very hard time explaining all this is because I grew up with all these things, and it is so ingrained in the kind of words we use that we don't really think about whether it's a brand thing or a like typology kind of thing. Hence why I can tell you Rui Yu is probably the part of the brand name, but Feng Yu I think is just a generic name for a specific kind of medicated oil. So actually Feng Yu is more common than Rui Yu. Rui Yu is like a very specific medicated oil that's just mainly for belly aches. Feng Yu is kind of more versatile. It's also like spicy. Feng Yu is kind of clear, oily, liquid. Usually comes in a smaller vial than glass vial than like Rui Yu. Rui Yu is reddish, comes in like a bigger container. But technically you can get Feng Yu in different sizes. My house just always had a small one. And um and so Feng Yu is sort of like more versatile. Um in my house we use it for like mosquito bites. We use it for if you have a headache you rub it on your temples. Um and then like for some reason a lot of older men who smoke seem to think that the smell of Feng Yu, which is quite strong by the way, covers up the fact that they've smoked. So I've also have this weird association of cigarette smoke smell with Feng Yu, which by the way is not a very good combination. It doesn't really hide the cigarette smells. But anyway, so what puzzled me when I was at this friend's house in Australia was that they were Asian clearly, but they had neither Feng Yu nor Rui Yu, and at that point in time I was just in such a bad, like I had such a bad stomach ache that I was just like I couldn't think, and the only thing they could offer was like maybe Panadol or something, and like I don't know, it just felt unacceptable in my head. I was just like I am in so much pain. I need Rui Yu or Feng Yu or whatever, right? And like yeah, technically Panadol did reduce the pain a bit, but I think it just never quite reaches the same level of comfort because it's not like directly acting on the outside of my stomach. It's not like releasing that spicy feeling, like that mental spicy feeling that I associate with like feeling better in a way. And it's just kind of doing like, you know, like dulling your pain sensors a bit by going into your body through a pill. And that's the first time I realized that it was not an obvious thing, right? And I think I associated all these medicated oils with being Asian, and like I don't think it is. So there have been other times where I've been overseas and like we just needed Feng Yu or Rui Yu. Usually if I'm overseas I'll buy Feng Yu because it's easier to find. There's a chance that you can find it in some Asian mart somewhere. And yeah, it's funny to me because I think that was the first time I've ever really thought, what is something so obvious to me that I've never even considered it to be like, I've never considered a situation where I would not have this medicated oils when I need it. And then I found myself in situations in which I did need them and I didn't have them. And that was, I guess, the starting point for me to realize that something that is obvious to me is actually not obvious at all to other people. So I'll say that's the first one. But after that, I started thinking about like what else is really obvious to me that is maybe not so much to other people. I think something mundane is also, for me, we use soap at home, like bar soap. And it's quite funny sometimes when I get recommended videos of people telling, like people who are not very comfortable, like not used to using soap, maybe more used to like liquid body wash and things like that, to like, you know, save all the soap ends, the little bits of soap that you get at the end where it's really hard to get bubbles from it, to kind of save all of it and then kind of put it into this like mesh or netting bag and then to use that to rub. I mean, that was just like one example I saw. And I thought that's quite funny because to me the obvious thing to do, which by the way, if you can't tell by the way I'm using the word obvious, it's not always obvious, is whenever I get like the little baby soap, and by baby I just mean that it's kind of reached the end of its lifespan, it's a bit too small for you to comfortably soap it up to use. I would just get a new bar of soap, put the little bit of soap onto the new one, and just kind of like mush them with water so that they stick together. It takes a while, it takes a bit of patience for it to stick, but once it sticks, it doesn't go away. And that's how we just keep like making use of all the soap ends or whatever you want to call them. That's just how we've always done it. So the new soap always has a bit of the old soap in it, and then it just continues to the next bar and so on. And so I found the idea of like collecting a mesh bag full of soap so that you can like lather it up a bit weird. But then maybe that's really obvious to them, and that's just like super not obvious to me because of how I've used soap at home. And then like other things that I think are obvious is like I have a lot of old notebooks from school, and by old I mean like they are blank. They are like there's no like notes inside, but it's just like, you know, when you bought too much and then you like never finish using them, or maybe you wrote like a few pages in it but you just tear those out and then the rest of the pages are blank and usable. So there's a bunch of like old school notebooks that are blank in my house, and for a while I didn't use them, but then like I do morning pages and like I don't really want to get like proper nice notebooks for them because that's not really the point of it. It doesn't bring me much joy, honestly, to make the notebook that much nicer. What gives me more joy is making the notebook mine. And so the thing that's obvious to me is if I like the notebook, like the interior of it, like the pages inside, and I want to use it, but I just hate the cover for some reason, because you know it's an old school notebook, or it could be that I just like maybe it's a notebook that somebody else has given me and it has a print or something that I don't like. What's obvious to me is I would redecorate it. I would either wrap it or like with some wrapping paper or with, I don't know, a new piece of paper so that I can draw on it or whatever. Or I can paint it. So sometimes the notebooks, when you open up inside, there's like printed stuff, like this notebook is a free gift from blah 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 event, that kind of stuff. I would just paint it over. And I think that's obvious to me. I think this is one of the things that's maybe less. I think more people would think this is obvious. Yeah, so things like that. And in fact, I think this comes back to something which I think about sometimes, which is that the idea of common sense is not common. And I think the sentiment behind that is that common sense is not common because it requires a certain cultural context for you to understand that common sense. And so what's common sense, or what I think people think it's the obvious choice or the default solution or the default option, is often not the same once you change the context. And I was thinking about this when I wrote one of the poems that I've published on this channel. I'll link it. Is it this side? Yes, I think it's this side. So so this is one thing that I encountered a lot when I was working in a cafe, which is, I mean, if you read it in the poem, I think you will get it, but the idea of like what is a coffee is not universal. Some people assume coffee to be black, meaning without milk, without sugar. Some people assume coffee to be with milk and with sugar. Some people assume coffee to be with milk but no sugar. Some people assume coffee to be hot. Other people assume coffee to be cold. Some people assume coffee to be espresso based. Other people assume coffee to be like the Nanyang style of coffee, which is not espresso based and a lot more like buttery, savory, thick. It feels to me like it has more caffeine, although I don't know whether that's always true. Things like that. So whenever people order a coffee, it becomes like, I mean, obviously when I was working as a barista, my job was to make sure that people got the type of coffee that they wanted. So I would have to ask, do you want it black or white? Do you want it with added sugar, without? How many shots? Is it hot? Is it ice? Things like that. And generally people are nice. Like they'll just tell you their order, especially if they just want a coffee. But there are some people who, for some reason, always look at me like I'm asking the obvious, which I think, like, to be fair to them, it probably seems really obvious, but it is surprisingly not. I think is the point that I'm trying to make, is that after I ask them a series of questions and probably annoyed the hell out of them, I find out that what they think is the default coffee is not what I would assume. So, like I said, some people assume that it's black and it's hot. Some people assume that it has milk and it's iced, and so on and so forth. There's different variations. There are some overlaps based on like where they're from, and sometimes you can kind of tell by like their accent or their dressing. Which again, by the way, I'm very bad at. I'm very bad at accents. Both recognizing it and being able to do one myself. Like I don't know what accent I have. Obviously it's a Singaporean one, but what I mean is like I'm kind of accent deaf in the sense. I can sort of tell when somebody has an accent, but only in the sense of like this is a way of speaking in which I find it a bit difficult to understand what they're saying. And so what I mean when I say I can't really tell what kind of accent I have is actually even within Singaporean accents, there is a bit of a spectrum of it. So there is the spectrum of like the really local auntie and uncles who mostly speak kind of like Singlish or broken English. And then moving slightly further from that end, you have people who can maybe speak in English with maybe slightly chopped up sentences or sentence structures that are a bit more reminiscent of their mother tongue or whichever language that they speak predominantly, which could be Mandarin, Malay, Tamil, other Indian languages, dialects, and so on. And so their sentence structure is a bit more reminiscent of the mother tongue, and hence the English sounds a bit strange. And also there is a certain tonal quality to the way they speak that sets it apart. And then on the other end, there is like, like I think what in Singapore we typically refer to as posh English, or like I'm trying to think of what people call this. It's kind of like jakangtan. And I'm not saying this very accurately, by the way, but basically it means people who eat potato, so people who are kind of like trying to be westernized, trying to be white, is the general sentiment. So basically I think like on the end of it is English with an accent that would be a bit more like either British or Americanized. And also I think sentence structure would be a bit more like proper English. And I'm somewhere here, which is why I think I've sort of set up the spectrum around myself this way, but I'm somewhere closer to like the posh English side of things, but I don't quite speak with the same accent, I think. But I can never be sure because I'm kind of accent deaf, so I know I don't sound exactly like the more like kopitiam speak, which would be like the local coffee shop kind of way of speaking. I can kind of sound like that if I'm talking to somebody who sounds like this. But I think it's more like a mirroring thing. I find it quite difficult to speak that way if I'm just speaking alone. Like if I'm speaking alone, like right now, this is what I normally sound like. I do sound a bit different when I'm not talking to a camera. Um, and I sound different depending on who I'm talking to. But anyway, that's a bit of a sidetrack. So I think like accent is another thing that I think some people think it's very obvious. It's never really that way to me. But again, I think that's related to like how much exposure you've had to that thing when you grew up. Like I can recognize a Singapore/Malaysian accent when I'm overseas and I hear somebody talking in that way, which other people may not be able to recognize. But that's just because I've grown up in Singapore. And I think in the same way, some people can recognize like regional accents or in like the UK, etc. Right? Like these things are obvious because of the context that you've had you growing up, and you know the other things are like how if you open up a butter cookie biscuit tin, it is sewing thread inside, things like that. Things that are very obvious to a certain group of people, certain demographic, is really not so. And I think it's funny because we don't really talk about these things super often. Obviously we do, because like there are some examples that I've raised, like the butter cookie tin. But it's less common than we think because these are so, they're kind of like the background noise of everyday life that it's so obvious that we don't talk about it. And I think there is value to noticing and sometimes talking about such stuff. Obviously some of this is not like particularly important necessarily, but I think to not realize that these are in fact options, I guess, that you can think about, like you can tweak if you want to, instead of just like default background things that you can't change, is like that awareness is important. I was going to make a point, but I forgot. And so I think I'll just leave it as this. I think sometimes I'm going to talk about things that are going to seem very obvious. And then I post it on the internet and I realize it's maybe not so. I remember what I was going to say. So I think the thing that I've been recently thinking about in terms of this obviousness is Singapore culture. Like, I can't quite put my finger on what Singapore culture is necessarily. And I think part of the reason why it eludes me is because it is so much like background noise to me, or like just in the background for me, it is so obvious that I don't think about it. And like the way I've managed to even see that this is a thing that I'm not very consciously aware of is because like I'll watch. So recently I've kind of been watching a lot of UK media, and I think from it getting a sense of like what UK culture could be like. I say could because I don't think I have the best understanding of it necessarily, but it's definitely more than I had before I started this binge of UK media, which includes things like listening to Blur songs over their various albums over the decades, watching Skins, the first generation. These are the things that come to mind, but there's a few other stuff. Then and so the idea of how, say, they are very aware that they are kind of people who don't always talk very directly and are always polite. So they would say no in like a lot of different ways that to people who are more used to speaking directly, for example, would not sound like a no. Yeah, like for example, one that I just saw yesterday was like somebody referring to how a British person might tell you that the food is not that great. Would be like, like instead of finishing the meal, they just kind of put it down and be like, I should not have filled up on bread earlier today, something like that. And I think to a person like me, that would just be like, okay, I get it. I mean, like, you're full. I wouldn't get the true meaning of things, which is that like maybe the meal that they have immediately in front of them is not super tasty, and that's just like their polite way of putting it. There are other examples, of course, but I'm just like giving one to kind of give an illustration, a taste of what I'm meaning. And so I think the reason why Singapore culture kind of eludes me is because it's so obvious to me that I can't quite put my finger on it. And I think that's why I find a lot of the content of like, people who are from a different culture going to a different country and staying there in the long term, pointing out what's the difference or what's obvious about that culture that's kind of like new to them, quite interesting. And I think the fact that there are people, there are creators who have quite a big following doing such stuff means that other people find this interesting as well. And so I think, I don't know. I don't really know what else to say about Singapore culture, and I feel like I'm just gonna get flagged for it. But like, I don't know. I find that sometimes it's like when you're too close to something, you can't see it. But at the same time, I feel like it's something that's worth trying to make sense of, make clearer. But I don't have an answer. And I'm gonna stop now because the last time I talked about Singapore, I got a weird comment. So I'm just gonna stop here because I haven't really fully formed my thoughts about it. Anyway, if you have anything that you personally find obvious, just share it with us in the comments. I'm curious to find what you think is or is not obvious. Doesn't really matter whether other people agree or not. I just find it interesting to know what you think is obvious. Alright, that's all for this video. I'll see you next time. Bye.